September 11th, 2001 is a definitive day which reminds us of terrorism. What happened on that day? Hello and welcome to UPSC History View. Today, let's learn about the September 11 attacks. The September 11 attacks, also 9/11 attacks, is a series of airline hijackings and suicide attacks committed in 2001 by 19 militants associated with the Islamic extremist group al-Qaeda against targets in the United States, the deadliest terrorist attacks on American soil in US history. The attacks against New York City and Washington DC caused extensive death and destruction and triggered an enormous US effort to combat terrorism. Some 2,750 people were killed in New York, 184 at the Pentagon, and 40 in Pennsylvania, where one of the hijacked planes crashed after the passengers attempted to retake the plane. All 19 terrorists died. Police and fire departments in New York were especially hard hit. Hundreds had rushed to the scene of the attacks, and more than 400 police officers and firefighters were killed. Let's learn about the plot. The September 11 attacks were precipitated in large part because Osama bin Laden, the leader of the militant Islamic organization al-Qaeda, held naive beliefs about the United States in the run-up to the attacks. Abu Walid al-Masri, an Egyptian who was bin Laden's associate in Afghanistan in the 1980s and 90s, explained that in the years prior to the attacks, bin Laden became increasingly convinced that America was weak. He believed that the United States was much weaker than some of those around him thought, Masri remembered. And as evidence, he referred to what happened to the United States in Beirut when the bombing of the Marines base led them to flee from Lebanon, referring to the destruction of the Marine barracks there in 1983, which killed 241 American servicemen. Bin Laden believed that the United States was a paper tiger, a belief shaped not just by America's departure from Lebanon following the Marine barrack bombings, but also by the withdrawal of American forces from Somalia in 1993, following the deaths of 18 US servicemen in Mogadishu, and the American pullouts from Vietnam in the 1970s. The key operational planner of the September 11 attacks was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who had spent his youth in Kuwait. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed became active in the Muslim Brotherhood, which he joined at age 16, and then he went to the United States to attend college, receiving a degree from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University in 1986. Afterward, he traveled to Pakistan and then Afghanistan to wage jihad against the Soviet Union, which had launched an invasion against Afghanistan in 1979. According to Yusri Fauda, a journalist at the Arabic language cable television channel Al Jazeera, who interviewed him in 2002, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed planned to blow up some dozen American planes in Asia during the mid-1990s, a plot that failed. But the dream of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed never faded. And I think by putting his hand in the hands of bin Laden, he realized that now he stood a chance of bringing about his long-awaited dream. In 1996, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed met bin Laden in Tora Bora, Afghanistan. The 9/11 Commission, set up in 2002 by President George W. Bush and the US Congress to investigate the attacks of 2001, explained that it was then that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed presented a proposal for an operation that would involve training pilots who would crash planes into buildings in the United States. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed dreamed up the tactical innovation of using hijacked planes to attack the United States. Al-Qaeda provided the personnel, money, and logistical support to execute the operation, and bin Laden wove the attacks on New York and Washington into a larger strategic framework of attacking the far enemy, the United States, in order to bring about regime change across the Middle East. The September 11 plot demonstrated that al-Qaeda was an organization of global reach. The plot played out across the globe with planning meetings in Malaysia, operatives taking flight lessons in the United States, coordination by plot leaders based in Hamburg, Germany, money transfers from Dubai, and recruitment of suicide operatives from countries around the Middle East, all activities that were ultimately overseen by al-Qaeda's leaders in Afghanistan. Key parts of the September 11 plot took shape in Hamburg. 4 of the key pilots and planners in the Hamburg cell who would take operational control of the September 11 attacks, including the lead hijacker Mohammad Atta, had a chance meeting on a train in Germany in 1999 with an Islamist militant who struck up a conversation with them about fighting jihad in the Russian Republic of Chechnya. The militant put the Hamburg cell in touch with an al-Qaeda operative living in Germany who explained that it was difficult to get to Chechnya at that time because many travelers were being detained in Georgia. He recommended they go to Afghanistan instead. Although Afghanistan was critical to the rise of al-Qaeda, it was the experience that some of the plotters acquired in the West that made them simultaneously more zealous and better equipped to carry out the attacks. 3 of the 4 plotters who would pilot the hijacked planes on September 11th and one of the key planners, Ramzi bin al-Shib, became more radical while living in Hamburg. Some combination of perceived or real discrimination, alienation, and homesickness seems to have turned them all in a more militant direction. Increasingly cutting themselves off from the outside world, they gradually radicalized each other. And eventually the friends decided to wage battle in bin Laden's global jihad, setting off for Afghanistan in 1999 in search of al-Qaeda. Atta and the other members of the Hamburg group arrived in 1999 in Afghanistan, right at the moment that the September 11 plot was beginning to take shape. Osama bin Laden and his military commander Mohammad Atif realized that Atta and his fellow Western-educated jihadists were far better suited to lead the attacks on Washington and New York than the men they had already recruited, leading bin Laden to appoint Atta to head the operation. The hijackers, most of whom were from Saudi Arabia, established themselves in the United States, many well in advance of the attacks. They traveled in small groups and some of them received commercial flight training. Throughout his stay in the United States, Atta kept bin al-Shib updated on the plot's progress via email. To cloak his activities, Atta wrote the message as if he were writing to his girlfriend Jenny, using innocuous code to inform bin al-Shib that they were almost complete in their training and readiness for the attacks. Atta wrote in one message, "The first semester commences in 3 weeks, 19 certificates for private education and 4 exams. The reference 19 certificates were code that identified the 19 al-Qaeda hijackers, while the 4 exams identified the targets of the attacks." In the early morning of August 29, 2001, Atta called bin al-Shib and said he had a riddle that he was trying to solve. 2 sticks, a dash, and a cake with a stick down. What is it? After considering the question, bin al-Shib realized that Atta was telling him that the attacks would occur in 2 weeks, the 2 sticks being the number 11 and the cake with a stick down a 9. Putting it together, it meant that the attacks would occur on 11/9 or 11 September. On September 5, bin al-Shib left Germany for Pakistan. Once there, he sent a messenger to Afghanistan to inform bin Laden about both the day of the attack and its scope. Let's learn about the attacks. On September 11, 2001, groups of attackers boarded 4 domestic aircraft at 3 East Coast airports, and soon after takeoff, they disabled the crews, some of whom may have been stabbed with box cutters the hijackers were secreting. The hijackers then took control of the aircraft, all large and bound for the West Coast with full loads of fuel. At 8:46 a.m., the first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, which had originated from Boston, was piloted into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. Most observers construed this initially to be an accident involving a small commuter plane. The second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, also from Boston, struck the South Tower 17 minutes later. At this point, there was no doubt that the United States was under attack. Each structure was badly damaged by the impact and erupted into flames. Office workers who were trapped above the points of impact in some cases leapt to their deaths rather than face the infernos now raging inside the towers. The third plane, American Airlines Flight 77, taking off from Dulles Airport near Washington, D.C., struck the southwest side of the Pentagon just outside the city at 9:37 a.m., touching off a fire in that section of the structure. Minutes later, the Federal Aviation Authority ordered a nationwide ground stop, and within the next hour at 10:03 a.m., the fourth aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93, from Newark, New Jersey, crashed near Shanksville in the Pennsylvania countryside after its passengers, informed of events via cellular phone, attempted to overpower their assailants. At 9:59 a.m., the World Trade Center's heavily damaged South Tower collapsed, and the North Tower fell 29 minutes later. Clouds of smoke and debris quickly filled the streets of Lower Manhattan. Office workers and residents ran in panic as they tried to outpace the billowing debris clouds. A number of other buildings adjacent to the Twin Towers suffered serious damage, and several subsequently fell. Fires at the World Trade Center site smoldered for more than 3 months. Rescue operations began almost immediately as the country and the world sought to come to grips with the enormity of the losses. Nearly 3,000 people had perished, some 2,750 people in New York, 184 at the Pentagon, and 40 in Pennsylvania. All 19 terrorists also died. Included in the total in New York City were more than 400 police officers and firefighters who had lost their lives after rushing to the scene and into the towers. On the morning of September 11th, President Bush had been visiting a second-grade classroom in Sarasota, Florida, when he was informed that a plane had flown into the World Trade Center. A little later, Andrew Card, his chief of staff, whispered in the president's right ear, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack."
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act.
To keep the president out of harm's way, Bush subsequently hopscotched across the country on Air Force One, landing in Washington, D.C. the evening of the attacks. At 8:30 p.m., Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office in a speech that laid out a key doctrine of his administration's future foreign policy. "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them."
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America. These acts shattered steel, but they cannot dent the steel of American resolve. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. Today our nation saw evil, the very worst of human nature, and we responded with the best of America, with the daring of our rescue workers, with the caring for strangers and neighbors who came to give blood and help in any way they could. Immediately following the first attack, I implemented our government's emergency response plans. Our military is powerful, and it's prepared. Our emergency teams are working in New York City and Washington, D.C. to help with local rescue efforts. Our first priority is to get help to those who have been injured and to take every precaution to protect our citizens at home and around the world from further attacks. The functions of our government continue without interruption. Federal agencies in Washington, which had to be evacuated today, are reopening for essential personnel tonight and will be open for business tomorrow. Our financial institutions remain strong, and the American economy will be open for business as well. The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. I appreciate so very much the members of Congress who have joined me in strongly condemning these attacks. And on behalf of the American people, I thank the many world leaders who have called to offer their condolences and assistance. America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world, and we stand together to win the war against terrorism. Tonight I ask for your prayers for all those who grieve, for the children whose worlds have been shattered, for all whose sense of safety and security has been threatened. And I pray they will be comforted by a power greater than any of us, spoken through the ages in Psalm 23. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. America has stood down enemies before, and we will do so this time. None of us will ever forget this day, yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world. Thank you, good night, and God bless America.
On September 14th, Bush visited Ground Zero, the smoking pile of debris of what remained of the World Trade Center and the thousands who had perished there. Standing on top of a wrecked fire truck, Bush grabbed a bullhorn to address the rescue workers working feverishly to find any survivors. When one of the workers said that he could not hear what the president was saying, Bush made one of the most memorable remarks of his presidency. "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear from all of us soon."
I want you all to know that America today is on bended knee in prayer for the people whose lives were lost here, for the workers who work here, for the families who mourn. This nation stands with the good people of New York City and New Jersey and Connecticut as we mourn the loss of thousands of our citizens. I can hear you. I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you. And the people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon. The nation sends its love and compassion to everybody who is here. Thank you for your hard work. Thank you for making the nation proud. and may God bless America.
Bush's robust response to the attacks drove his poll ratings from 55% favorable before September 11th to 90% in the days after, the highest ever recorded for a president. Let's learn about the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. The emotional distress caused by the attacks, particularly the collapse of the Twin Towers, New York City's most visible landmark, was overwhelming. Unlike the relatively isolated site of the Pearl Harbor attack of 1941, to which the September 11 events were soon compared, the World Trade Center lay at the heart of one of the world's largest cities. Hundreds of thousands of people witnessed the attacks firsthand, and millions watched the tragedy unfold live on television. In the days that followed September 11th, the footage of the attacks was replayed in the media countless times, as were the scenes of throngs of people stricken with grief gathering at Ground Zero. As the site where the towers once stood came to be commonly known, some with photos of missing loved ones, seeking some hint of their fate. Moreover, world markets were badly shaken. The towers were at the heart of New York's financial district, and damage to Lower Manhattan's infrastructure, combined with fears of stock market panic, kept New York markets closed for 4 trading days. Markets afterwards suffered record losses. The attacks also stranded tens of thousands of people throughout the United States as US airspace remained closed for commercial aviation till September 13th, and normal service, with more rigid security measures, did not resume for several days. The September 11th attacks were an enormous tactical success for al-Qaeda. The strikes were well coordinated and hit multiple targets in the heart of the enemy, and the attacks were magnified by being broadcast around the world to an audience of untold millions. The September 11 propaganda of the deed took place in the media capital of the world, which ensured the widest possible coverage of the event. Not since television viewers had watched the abduction and murder of Israeli athletes during the Munich Olympics in 1972 had a massive global audience witnessed a terrorist attack unfold in real time. If al-Qaeda had been a largely unknown organization before September 11th, in the days after it became a household name. After the attacks of September 11th, countries allied with the United States rallied to its support, perhaps best symbolized by the French newspaper Le Monde's headline, "We are all Americans now." Even in Iran, thousands gathered in the capital, Tehran, for a candlelight vigil. Evidence gathered by the United States soon convinced most governments that the Islamic militant group al-Qaeda was responsible for the attacks. The group had been implicated in previous terrorist strikes against Americans, and bin Laden had made numerous anti-American statements. Al-Qaeda was headquartered in Afghanistan and had forged a close relationship with that country's ruling Taliban militia, which subsequently refused US demands to extradite bin Laden and to terminate al-Qaeda activity there. For the first time in history, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, invoked Article 5, allowing its members to respond collectively in self-defense, and on October 7th, the US and allied military forces launched an attack against Afghanistan, which came to be known as the Afghanistan War. Within months, thousands of militants were killed or captured, and Taliban and al-Qaeda leaders were driven into hiding. In addition, the US government exerted great effort to track down other al-Qaeda agents and sympathizers throughout the world and made combating terrorism the focus of US foreign policy. Meanwhile, security measures within the United States were tightened considerably at such places as airports, government buildings, and sports venues. To help facilitate the domestic response, Congress quickly passed the Usa Patriot Act, which significantly but temporarily expanded the search and surveillance powers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or FBI, and other law enforcement agencies. Additionally, a cabinet-level Department of Homeland Security was established. Despite their success in causing widespread destruction and death, the September 11 attacks were a strategic failure for al-Qaeda. Following September 11th, al-Qaeda, whose name in Arabic means the base, lost the best base it ever had in Afghanistan. Later, some in al-Qaeda's leadership, including those who, like Egyptian Saif al-Adel, had initially opposed the attacks, tried to spin the Western intervention in Afghanistan as a victory for al-Qaeda. Al-Adel, one of the group's military commanders, explained in an interview 4 years later that the strikes on New York and Washington were part of a far-reaching and visionary plan to provoke the United States into some ill-advised actions. Such strikes will force the person to carry out random acts and provoke him to make serious and sometimes fatal mistakes. The first reaction was the invasion of Afghanistan. But there is not a shred of evidence that in the weeks before September 11, al-Qaeda's leaders made any plans for an American invasion of Afghanistan. Instead, they prepared only for possible US cruise missile attacks or airstrikes by evacuating their training camps. Also, the overthrow of the Taliban hardly constituted an American mistake. The first and only regime in the modern Muslim world that ruled according to al-Qaeda's rigid precepts was toppled. And with it was lost an entire country that al-Qaeda had once enjoyed as a safe haven. And in the wake of the fall of the Taliban, al-Qaeda was unable to recover anything like the status it once had as a terrorist organization with considerable sway over Afghanistan. Bin Laden disastrously misjudged the possible US responses to the September 11th attacks, which he believed would take one of the two forms: an eventual retreat from the Middle East along the lines of the US pullout from Somalia in 1993, or another ineffectual round of cruise missile attacks similar to those that followed al-Qaeda's bombings of American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania in 1998. Neither of these two scenarios happened. The US campaign against the Taliban was conducted with pinpoint strikes from American air power, tens of thousands of Northern Alliance forces, and more than 300 US Special Forces soldiers on the ground working with 110 officers from the Central Intelligence Agency or CIA. In November, just 2 months after the September 11 attacks, the Taliban fell to the Northern Alliance and the United States. Still, it was just the beginning of what would become the longest war in US history, as the United States tried to prevent the return of the Taliban and their al-Qaeda allies. In December 2001, faced with the problem of where to house prisoners as the Taliban fell, the administration decided to hold them at Guantanamo Bay, which the US had been leasing from Cuba since 1903. As Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld put it on December 27, 2001, I would characterize Guantanamo Bay, Cuba as the least worst place we could have selected. Guantanamo was attractive to administration officials because they believed it placed the detainees outside the reach of American laws, such as the right to appeal their imprisonment. Yet it was only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, making it accessible to the various agencies that would need to travel there to extract information from what was believed to be a population of hundreds of dangerous terrorists. Eventually, some 800 prisoners would be held there, although the prison population was reduced to less than 175 by the time of the 10th anniversary of the September 11 attacks. In his State of the Union speech on Jan 29, 2002, President Bush laid out a new doctrine of preemptive war, which went well beyond the long-established principle that the United States would go to war to prevent an adversary launching an attack that imminently threatened the country. Bush declared, "I will not wait on events while dangers gather. I will not stand by as peril draws closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons." Bush identified those dangerous regimes as an axis of evil that included Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. At the graduation ceremony for West Point cadets on June 1, 2002, Bush elaborated on his preemptive war doctrine, saying to the assembled soon-to-be graduates and their families, "If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we will have waited too long. Bush believed that there would be a demonstration effect in destroying Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq that would deter groups like al-Qaeda or indeed anyone else who might be inclined to attack the United States. Under Secretary of Defense Douglas J. Feith later explained, "Whatever we did after 9/11 was look broadly at the international terrorist network from which the next attack on the United States might come. And we did not focus narrowly only on the people who were specifically responsible for 9/11. Our main goal was preventing the next attack." Though there was no evidence that Saddam Hussein's government in Iraq had collaborated with al-Qaeda in the September 11 attacks, the United States prepared for conflict against Iraq in its global war against terror, broadly defined. On 19 March 2003, on eve of the invasion of Iraq, President Bush issued the order for war. "For the peace of the world and the benefit and freedom of the Iraqi people, I hereby give the order to execute Operation Iraqi Freedom. May God bless the troops." On March 20th, the American-led invasion of Iraq began. Within 3 weeks, US forces controlled Baghdad, and the famous pictures of the massive statue of Saddam Hussein being toppled from its plinth were broadcast around the world. Thank you very much for listening to this discussion on the September 11th attacks. For more such discussions, get the UPSC Practice app from the App Store.